Great. I'm so excited to be here. My first time to Macon, Georgia. And I must say, I would vote your airport to be the best airport in the country. It was the first time in probably decades where it wasn't a stressful, anxiety-provoking experience. So your airport is phenomenal. I'm sorry that you have a direct pipeline to Washington, D.C. now. I heard that there was one to Baltimore. There's a little bit of buffer there, but now you have just direct access to us. I'm located in Washington, D.C., so it's fantastic to leave the Beltway and come talk to those who support small businesses, small business owners across the country. Thank you to the Georgia Chamber of Commerce for the invitation. It's always a thrill to come down here and speak to those in Georgia. The National Federation of Independent Business is an advocacy association that represents small businesses on a federal level and also on a state level. So we have our state director, Hunter Logan, with us. And those issues that are of interest and problematic, headwinds for small business owners in Georgia, a lot of them are the same issues related to small business owners across the country. In the Research Center, we ask a lot of questions on small businesses, of small business owners, how they operate their business, what their biggest issues are in operating their business. And we've been around, the Research Center has been around for about 50 years, so we have a lot of information about the historical context of the challenges and opportunities facing small business owners across the country. I have a few slides that shows the census region that Georgia is in. It does border, DC down to Florida, so it's that whole mix, but it gives some indication of where that your census region kind of falls within the national context. So I have about 20 slides here. It does frame it like a movie. It's dramatic, it's a tearjerker. It has high points and low points. We'll end in a good place. So let's get started. The Small Business Optimism Index, this is a survey that we've been conducting for 51 years. So the dotted horizontal line is, the quarterly and monthly line. When we first started this survey, our chief economist, Bill Dunkelberg, or how we affectionately call him Dunk, if you've heard that name, he started the survey as a quarterly survey. So from the fourth quarter in 1973 up until 1985, it was quarterly. After that, we offered him the great responsibility of conducting the survey every month. So we had something new to say every month about the small business sector. This survey, it's a random sample of NFIB's membership of about 300,000 members. I think we're the last bastion of survey folks to mail out a survey. We do this old school, it's a mail survey. It's a data entry, labor-intensive process, but we want to make sure that we are able to collect as much information from business owners across the country to highlight where they are in operating their business in the economy and their biggest struggles in operating their business. So our headline measure, and this is our main product, our flagship product in the Research Center that gives us a better idea of the small business economy. The Small Business Optimism Index is our headline measure of the health of the small business economy. So the index is of 10 questions within the survey. The survey itself is roughly 40 questions total. All of the questions have remained basically the same since its inception. The index is looking forward, so most of the questions are related to capital spending plans, sales expectations, inventory plans, inventory satisfaction, outlook on business conditions, outlook on expansions, unfilled job openings, hiring plans, those sorts of questions. And so it gives us an overall feel of how they're doing. So not surprisingly, over the last number of years, small business owner optimism has been depressed. And when looking at sentiment surveys, some of it's sentiment in our survey, some not. We ask what they're doing, but we also ask how they think of business conditions. In this survey, and along with other sentiment surveys, for pretty much the whole history of this survey, when optimism has been low, we're in a recession. Things aren't going well. Consumer spending has declined. GDP is in decline, or at least growing very slowly. So we see that the other dotted line is the average of that series. So we're looking at the average compared to the last data point. Right now, we're about average. So the average of the 51 years is 98. We're right now a bit above that at, I believe it's 98.8. So we're looking at an average, but in context of the economic conditions, we weren't in a recession. Everybody was talking about a recession. Every time I turned on Bloomberg, it was, when is the next recession? And we didn't see it we saw it in our survey, but we didn't see it among small business owners and how they were talking about their business. When talking about their business, they talked about how difficult it was in operating their business. So what it looked like with the labor market, if they were trying to fill jobs or trying to fill open positions, if they were looking to hire, if they were trying to manage prices in the wake of 2022 when inflation spiked to over 9% year over year. It was challenging. So while consumers were still spending, businesses were still spending, it was incredibly difficult for owners to operate their business. They were spending more time in their business filling in for jobs that they couldn't fill. They were spending more time in their business trying to figure out how to price their products, stay competitive, but not lose profit margin, or at least enough profit margin where they're still making some money in their business, because earnings is the first hit in trying to absorb price increases. So in context of the last number of years, optimism was down, not in a recession. It was just incredibly difficult to operate their business. A couple years ago, we started an uncertainty index. And so this is looking at those questions where business owners are saying, I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to plan capital expenditures in the next 6 months. I don't know if I'm going to fill those positions. I don't know if I'm going to hire in the next 6 months. They're not saying yes, they're not saying no, they have no idea. Why don't they have any idea? Because of the configuration of economic conditions is this hodgepodge mess of moving parts, and they don't know what it looks like in the near term as far as investing in their business, spending money to fill those positions, or buying equipment or land or fleets of cars or anything like that. And so they're in this space that's very uncomfortable for them. Certainly we don't want the certainty to be that they know things are bad. That's terrible. However, it is a position of knowing how to move forward in your business. When you have no idea, it's a very challenging space. And so we've heard this from many small business owners, and this is why we put together this uncertainty index. We had no idea that over the last number of years, I would be saying the word uncertainty about 20,000 times a day, but this is very helpful to put it into context. So we're still at very elevated levels of business owners within this index saying that they are uncertain about how to move forward with their business. One of the questions that we just started about 4 months ago is the overall health of your business. How are you feeling about the overall health of your business? And looking at, here we go. So the overall, about 2/3 of small business owners say that their business is doing excellent or good. About 1/3 are saying fair, just a few are saying poor. This was our question to better evaluate if indeed we're going into a recession, things are starting to fall apart a bit, the shifting of business owners that are in our sample saying shifting to kind of the lower of the fair and poor categories. Over the last 4 months, we haven't seen it. So things seem to be holding up quite well. It's just, again, very uncertain and very stress-inducing to operate their business within the economic conditions that they're facing. The South Atlantic, again, this is a census region that includes all the way from DC down to Florida. The eastern side includes Georgia, and it's in the middle of the pack as far as the health of their business. Not surprisingly, the Pacific is the one that's feeling the most challenges, but the Pacific is from Washington to California, mostly California, and they have problems. So they're probably going to be always at the end of the pack, regardless of economic conditions. They just struggle disproportionately with other businesses related to taxes and regulations. So that's generally their more heavy burden in operations. So one of the questions within our survey, and this is the one that for those questions that I get about our survey and what does this mean, I have to explain quite a bit. What is the outlook? How do you see business conditions in the next 6 months? Do you think they're going to get better or worse or stay the same? So this is the net percent of business owners saying that those better minus those who think it's going to get worse. So not surprisingly, during COVID, most small business owners, or disproportionately small business owners, were saying, I think things are going to get worse. It went from business restrictions on operations to inflation to a tight labor market. The reasons for that pessimistic outlook changed, but they were strong headwinds regardless. And so a lot of small business owners felt like things were going to get worse. The election happened. The configuration of Congress and the new administration buoyed small business owners' expectations on the expectation that taxes would stay low. They would pass and extend, make permanent the Tax Cut and Jobs Act provisions that are so important for small business owners, specifically that small business deduction on qualifying income. Also, that there would be a more friendly regulatory environment for business owners to operate in, and those were the expectations. Those were the promises during the campaign. That's why we saw this massive spike in their outlook for business conditions after the election. All of these things make a huge difference for small business owners in operating their business. So this is where I have to explain that small business owners, most of them tend to be conservative. Why are they conservative? Because of taxes and regulations and making it less difficult for them to operate. They have enough challenges as is without the federal government stepping in to control things. So this spiked, it's come down quite a bit. So with the expectation of lower taxes, more friendly regulatory environment, trade happened. Trade negotiations, the immigration reconfiguration of that policy structure, but mostly trade and tariffs. It was a wrench for many small business owners to try and figure out how to deal with those headwinds and those challenges. And even if not directly hit, it was the anticipation of what this might look like as far as increased costs, increased input prices, how small business owners were going to absorb those added costs. A little bit more about that is that it's still been holding your breath environment for many small business owners. Those who are directly impacted are directly impacted. They know that they're hit. They're trying to work through it. For everybody else, we're still waiting or anticipating those price hikes in either inventory supplies, those sorts of business inputs, that at least in the federal data, we haven't seen any huge spikes yet. Folks are anticipating that will likely occur in the last half of this year. So good time to expand another one of our sentiment questions. And again, this question, very low levels through the pandemic, even further through, They might have opportunities to expand, but it's really difficult to expand if you can't fill those open positions that you already have. It's really difficult to expand when you can't control price increases that seem insurmountable to try and deal with, absorb, and pass along to customers and stay competitive. So while consumer spending and business spending were fairly stable and supportive over this time frame, it's been difficult for those who have expansion opportunities to actually do that. Actual earnings, this is one question where it's always been below zero. Not sure what's going on here. Probably would take a whole lot of psychiatrists and psychologists to figure this one out. But for the whole history of the survey, more small business owners in answering this question have said that they've had lower profits versus higher profits, or higher earnings. So we've been at from the average, a low level for the last number of years because, again, as small business owners, as you know, your earnings is the first hit in absorbing price increases in business operations. So your earnings are the first hit until you can move around and adjust business operations to save money or pass along those price increases to customers. So we've seen this scenario for at least the last 4 years. Actual sales changes, this is an area, high, again, net percent, higher minus lower sales in the last quarter versus the prior quarter, and we've seen this slowly decline. So it's not that we're going into a recession according to other data points, even though it might look like it in this, it's just coming off of a very high level during the pandemic when everybody was spending all the money that they received either in stimulus money or small businesses, business to business, because of the support programs that were in place, the Paycheck Protection Program, and all the other acronym programs that I have conveniently tried to erase from my memory. Real sales expectations. After the election, there was this huge bounce in small business owners anticipating that there might be a spike in sales going forward with the promises and expectations of lower taxes and a more friendly regulatory environment. But that has edged off a bit, again, likely related to the change in trade policy. Wanted to just show this because actual and expected sales, generally there is an expectation of higher sales than there is actual sales. That's just a dynamic of how people respond to these two questions. But recently, the gap between the two has been very large, and so over the next few months, I'm sure that we'll see those two align a bit more than they have been over the last number of months. And then here we are with inflation. So this is the inflation picture that we've talked about a lot at NFIB. And this is actual price increases. Again, the net percent of those saying that they increased prices minus those who said that they decreased prices. We're still far above the average reading over the last 51 years. But the last time that anybody had any inflation pressures would be those businesses that have been around for 50 years and have likely don't have historical knowledge or can tap into those feelings of what it felt like in the late 70s or early to late 70s when inflation was a significant problem. But ever since then, we've seen a spike maybe here and there when oil prices spiked, and so gas prices were a huge problem for absorbing those input costs, but nothing like we've experienced over the last number of years. And so this has been a headwind that is largely unfamiliar to small business owners and trying to figure out how to deal with that. So we're still seeing inflation run a bit higher than normal. It is edging down, thankfully, but still those pressures exist with small business owners. Price plans going forward, again, this is an area where their expectation of what they think prices will look like in the next 3 months haven't aligned with what they've had to do. So expectations are generally lower than what they've had to do in increasing prices. That again is a very tough position for small business owners and often stressful to navigate those two, not having planned for the actual price increases that they have to absorb. Single most important problem. So one of the questions is, what is your single most important problem in operating your business? Inflation has been the dominant problem, along with labor quality over the last number of years. Inflation has come down sharply, which is good to see. That it's not quite the pressure cooker that we've seen, but this would be the indication that if tariffs started to drive up prices, we would see this turn around and start to increase, but we haven't yet. Unfilled job openings, we're still far above the historical average. So I know that for construction and in the Atlanta region, lots of construction. Last time I was there, it looked like a sea of construction cranes, and I thought, maybe this is where all the construction workers are. But the job openings, the job openings are concentrated in a few industries: construction, transportation, and manufacturing for small business owners. Those are the three industries where it's most prevalent, and construction far outweighs those other industries of the number of unfilled job openings that they still have. Hiring plans have leveled off a bit. Could be that they're just not in need of thinking about expanding their labor force. They're still struggling to fill those open positions. So that seems to be the dominant problem right now, is those existing positions are hard to fill. Fewer business owners are planning to increase those number of open positions going forward. And then actual compensation changes. So this is an area, again, with a tight labor market, small business owners having to deal with absorbing those higher costs to be competitive, attract applicants for open positions, but also retain current employees. So in either bonuses, increased wages, higher annual increases in compensation. So that is one of the areas that's been a struggle for a lot of small business owners that is coming down to the average. And then the same with compensation plans. This is also one of the areas that was talked about quite a bit over the last number of years, is the actual increase in compensation and the gap between actual increase in compensation versus planned compensation increases. So far more small business owners were having to increase compensation, not planning for it, and then having the difficult time of figuring out how to absorb those costs, either through adjusting business operations again or passing along those costs to customers. And with the single most important problem, two of the selection responses are labor quality and labor costs. We saw those increase over the last number of months, or last number of years, sorry. But labor quality has been the dominant part of that equation. So even if they are very competitive with wages, still difficult in finding those interested in filling jobs, again, especially in construction, transportation, manufacturing. At the beginning or the end of kind of the COVID restrictions, it was also in restaurants and a lot of services industry, but right now it is dominated of those industries, especially in construction. Actual capital expenditures. So not surprising, during the height of the pandemic and business restrictions, there was a huge drop-off in small business owners making capital expenditures, buying equipment, buying cars, all of that related to, if it was available, because we had huge supply chain disruptions, which is another area that many small business owners are anticipating in the disruptions related to imports of the latest trade policy negotiations and how that's going to come up in our data. We haven't seen it yet, but we anticipate, again, in the next few months, seeing supply chain disruptions becoming a bigger issue. But capital spending has fluctuated quite a bit over the last number of years. At the beginning, it was trying to secure inventory and things like that when business operations were eased a bit and things became a bit more normal. But the supply chain disruptions and then, not surprisingly, interest rates. So being able to finance those expenses, very hard. Financing costs are still very expensive. The Fed isn't looking to cut rates, at least, well, today they are holding steady. I think folks are thinking that by the end of the year, possibly 1 to 2 rate cuts, but they will be small. Small business owners will likely not feel a market decrease in the cost of financing. So this will still be a headwind for a lot of small business owners, is the cost of financing. And then planned capital outlays. And we've seen historically lower levels of those planning to make capital outlays in their business. Again, either for the reasons of higher financing costs if they're financing these purchases, or trying to hold on to a bit more cash in anticipation of some of the disruptions that they might anticipate going forward. Regular borrowing, again, this is an area that's been in decline over the last number of decades, at least a decade, and during the pandemic saw a huge drop. But this was likely the huge drop for regular borrowers. For those businesses that were still in operation, we likely wouldn't have seen that much movement for this question, except they were receiving PPP loans and EIDLs and all of those things, ERTC credits. And so there wasn't a lot of need for borrowing of small business owners. And this was an area that we had to talk about and explain quite a bit, that it wasn't a lack of credit, it was just no interest in credit because of all these support programs that were available to small business owners. But lately, we have seen an increase in interest rates. So again, those borrowing costs are becoming more expensive, not to the point of where we were at the beginning of this survey, where interest rates were through the roof, and Paul Volcker was trying to squash inflation outside of interest rates, and he did that pretty well, but it was very painful. Most important problem for this, regulations and taxes. So I said that I was going to end on a positive note. It doesn't quite look like it if I'm talking about regulations and taxes, but there is a positive angle to this in that small business owners, taxes, regulations are the weight in the backpack that they have to carry in operating their business. It is the constant. Both have become more difficult as far as their single most important problem, but largely it's because all of those other issues have started to ease up. So instead of the proverbial, I use the analogy of the hiker, backpack, weights, those are taxes and regulations. Inflation hits, it's a sprained ankle. Labor market tightening, it's sprain the other ankle. Those are major headwinds. Those disrupt business operations in a significant way. Taxes and regulations are kind of the constant issues that small business owners have to face, and they have, especially taxes, have been creeping up. This also could be in the stress and fear of what it looks like as far as Congress trying to pass this massive, great, big, beautiful bill that holds all of the tax provisions that are set to expire at the end of the year, and waiting for the expectation for them to pass this bill, make those provisions permanent, so at least that part of uncertainty is off the table. So that is the Small Business Economy movie, a bit of drama, a bit of elevated, optimistic areas, ending with taxes and regulations. Thank you, and I think I have a few minutes to take questions. Okay, with no questions, I will hand it back over. Thank you very much.